Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly busy and occasionally ridiculous life of Paleolithic humans. What did cavemen actually do all day? Turns out, it wasn't just rock smashing and fire discovery montages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The average day for a caveman began at dawn, or slightly before, depending on how loud the wind was or whether someone nearby started coughing again. Most people slept on animal hides or directly on packed earth, sometimes with a layer of dried grass or leaves for padding. You probably slept near a fire. Not for ambience, for heat and to keep insects and predators away. Sleeping away from the group wasn't really an option unless you wanted to wake up missing a foot. Most people slept in small, tight groups, families, extended families, and whoever else was part of the local band. Privacy didn't exist. Everyone heard everything. The first thing you did after waking up was check the fire. If it went out, someone had to restart it. That could take time, patience, and a lot of rubbing sticks together. If it was cold out, which, depending on the season it often was, everyone would be cranky until it came back to life. Next, you might look over your tools and weapons. Spears, knives, scrapers, anything that could be used for hunting or protection. These had to be kept in good condition. Losing your tools meant losing your ability to get food, defend yourself, or process meat and hides. Some people in the group were better at this than others, and it wasn't unusual to borrow gear from someone more skilled, though they probably expected something in return. Children were usually the first to make noise. They'd start moving around, looking for something to eat or something to do, often both. Adults would slowly get up and begin preparing for the day. That could mean gathering water, checking nearby traps, or heading out to look for signs of animal movement. No one eased into the day. There was no time for that. Your daily goal was simple: stay warm, find food, and avoid injury. If you woke up in one piece, your fire was still burning, and nothing outside looked immediately dangerous, you were already ahead. In the Paleolithic era, personal hygiene existed, just not in the way we think of it today. Cleanliness was mostly practical, not aesthetic. You cleaned yourself when it started interfering with your ability to live, or when the smell became a group issue. Bathing happened, but it depended heavily on the season and environment. If there was a stream, people washed in it, when the water wasn't freezing. Otherwise, cleaning might involve wiping off dirt with leaves, handfuls of sand, or on rare luxury occasions, animal fat. That's right, fat could be used to scrub the skin, which sounds odd until you realise it also helped with warmth and insect control. Teeth were another story. There were no toothbrushes, but some people chewed fibrous sticks or bones to clean their teeth. Dental wear was common, especially since the Paleolithic diet involved tough meat, unprocessed grains, and sand particles from grinding stones that got into food. Cavemen didn't brush, but they also didn't eat candy, so cavities were rare. Tooth loss from injury or wear, however, was a different matter. Hair care was minimal. Hair was usually long, tied back, or simply ignored. Lice were common. Some groups used ash, dirt, or animal oils to reduce infestations. Others may have resorted to the always effective method of scratching a lot and hoping it goes away. There's also evidence from later prehistoric periods of primitive combs or grooming tools, so some effort was made. Eventually. Clothing didn't help matters. Animal hides weren't breathable, and they weren't washed often. If they smelled, people either got used to it or blamed the person sitting closest to the fire. Feet were mostly bare, or covered in wraparound hide shoes. As you can imagine, the smell of a prehistoric cave was distinctive. But here's the surprising part. Despite the lack of soap or showers, early humans adapted well. Their immune systems were strong, and their communities understood enough about cleanliness to avoid major outbreaks. In fact, people probably smelled about the same, so no one really noticed unless you did something extreme, like roll in a dead animal. Which, by the way, some people did, for camouflage, breakfast. There was no set time to eat. People ate when they could, what they could, and only if there was anything left over from the day before. If you woke up to find a bit of dried meat still hanging by the fire, congratulations, you'd won the prehistoric lottery. But most mornings didn't start that way. If last night's hunt had failed, or the food was already eaten, or stolen by a raccoon-like creature with ambition, then breakfast meant foraging. This might involve digging for roots, checking nearby berry bushes, or scanning the landscape for edible plants that hadn't already been claimed by animals or children. The choices were seasonal. Spring meant greens, summer brought fruits, and winter brought hunger. Protein was more unpredictable. Small animals like birds, rabbits, or insects were occasionally caught and eaten whole or roasted. Insects were a reliable protein source, even if nobody was particularly excited about it. If you found a termite mound or a handful of grubs, that might become the morning meal. They didn't taste great, but they didn't bite back either. Sometimes you'd share with others, especially within your own family group. But food was a resource, not a courtesy. If someone brought back breakfast, it meant they were either generous or in charge. Or both. Water was another priority. Streams, springs, and rivers were the main sources, if you were lucky. If not, puddles had to do. Boiling water wasn't a common practice yet, so most water was consumed raw and occasionally accompanied by bacteria, your gut either defeated or deeply regretted. Occasionally, there'd be a leftover from the last big hunt. Smoked meat, marrow from cracked bones, or dried strips of hide that were technically edible with enough chewing. These were valuable. People stored them high, wrapped, or hidden, though nothing could stop a determined child with a stick. So every morning was a new gamble. Maybe you'd find a few berries and a half-roasted squirrel. Maybe you'd find nothing. Either way, no one skipped breakfast on purpose. After breakfast, or the realization that breakfast wasn't happening, the next big task of the day was tool maintenance. Tools weren't just accessories, they were survival equipment. Without a good edge, you couldn't cut meat, scrape hides, or defend yourself. So, a surprising amount of the day was spent hunched over rocks, hitting other rocks, trying to get just the right shape. Welcome to Paleolithic tool-making, part craftsmanship, part trial and error, and entirely dependent on not smashing your thumb. The raw material of choice? Flint, or obsidian, if you were feeling fancy and lived near a volcano. These stones chipped predictably, which meant you could flake off sharp edges and create cutting tools. The basic starter pack included hand axes, scrapers, spearheads, and the very popular rock with a handle. There was no one-size-fits-all. Each tool had a purpose. Some for butchering, others for shaping wood, and some for tasks we still don't fully understand but probably involved hitting things. Most people made their own tools, but like everything else, some were better at it than others. If someone in the group had a knack for making perfectly balanced spear points, they earned respect, and requests. Sharpening tools was constant. A dull edge was basically useless, and worse, dangerous. You'd either hurt yourself or waste time. Stones were ground, flaked, and tested daily. And yes, sometimes this meant spending 2 hours making something that broke after 2 minutes of use. You didn't complain, you just started over. Toolkits were often passed down, traded, or even stolen. If you lost yours, you weren't just embarrassed, you were in serious trouble. The moment you had nothing sharp on hand was usually the moment something with claws showed up. Occasionally, creativity kicked in. Someone might tie a rock to a stick with animal sinew and call it a hammer. Others discovered bone tools, flexible, lightweight, and perfect for fine tasks. These innovations were the seeds of later technological revolutions, even if their inventors were mostly just trying to cut something faster. Once the tools were ready, and breakfast, or the lack thereof, had been resolved, it was time to tackle the main event, the hunt. Hunting in the Paleolithic world wasn't a solo hobby. It was a full-team operation, often involving every able-bodied member of the group, plus one guy who mostly shouted useful things like, "Go left," and "That's not a deer." Large animals were the jackpot. Mammoths, bison, wild horses. Anything big enough to feed the entire group for a week was worth the risk. But they were also dangerous. Mammoths didn't just stand around waiting to be speared. They were fast, heavy, and had no patience for hairless bipeds with wooden sticks. Planning a hunt took real coordination. Scouts went ahead to track herds. Others prepared traps, pits covered with branches, natural choke points near rivers, or just steep cliffs if the group was feeling ambitious and slightly reckless. Then came the ambush, yelling, spear throwing, and a lot of running. The hope was that something large would go down, preferably before someone in your group did. For smaller game, deer, boars, or even rabbits, the process was more straightforward. Spears, clubs, and clever ambushes were used. Traps and snares helped too, especially for solo or small group hunters. But even with smaller animals, things went wrong. One misstep, and suddenly you were chasing a pig through the woods while trying to explain to your group how you almost had it. Sometimes the hunting party came back victorious, dragging meat, bones, and bragging rights. Other times they came back with nothing but scrapes and excuses. The wind shifted was a popular one. So was blaming whoever sneezed during the ambush. Meat wasn't just food, it was status. The person who delivered the kill often earned first pick, more respect, and fewer chores that night. But sharing was still common. You needed your group, and burning bridges over meat led to awkward silences around the fire. Hunting wasn't just about survival. It was teamwork, risk, and real-time strategy, all while trying not to get trampled. Not everyone in the Paleolithic world chased mammoths. Some people had a much more practical job, finding things that didn't fight back. Foraging wasn't as dramatic as hunting, but it was essential, and frankly, more successful most of the time. You didn't always catch a deer, but odds were decent you'd find a berry bush. The foraging crew, often made up of women, older adults, and kids who weren't old enough to throw a spear without hitting a tree, covered a lot of ground. They searched for edible plants, berries, nuts, roots, seeds, mushrooms, and anything else that didn't taste like regret. Knowing what was safe to eat was a matter of experience, trial and error, and unfortunately, the occasional funeral. Foragers developed strong mental maps of their terrain. They remembered which valleys had tubers, which trees dropped the best nuts, and which plants looked edible but definitely weren't. They passed this knowledge down carefully. Mistaking a good route for a poisonous one could turn your afternoon snack into an emergency. But it wasn't all safe and slow-paced. Sometimes foragers had to deal with wildlife too. Competing with birds, squirrels, or even bears over berries was a very real thing. And stepping into a wasp nest while reaching for honey was a mistake no one made twice, voluntarily. Foraging also meant multitasking. While gathering food, people might also collect firewood, feathers, bark, or herbs for medicine. Children tagged along, learning the ropes, and occasionally trying to eat things they shouldn't. You kept an eye on them, and tried not to lose track of anyone while arguing over whether that mushroom looked weird this time. The food gathered was often more reliable than hunted meat. Plants don't run away, nuts don't stab you, and if you timed it right, a single day's harvest could feed the group for several meals, or at least provide snacks between failed hunts. Foragers were the quiet heroes of the tribe. They weren't dramatic, they didn't show off. But when the hunting party returned empty-handed, it was the gatherers who saved dinner. If there was one thing that made Paleolithic life even remotely manageable, it was fire. Fire cooked your food, kept you warm, scared off predators, and let you see your own feet after sunset. Without it, your odds of survival dropped fast, which is why every group had an unspoken rule: don't let the fire go out. Someone, usually whoever got the short end of the stick that day, was put on fire duty. This meant keeping an eye on the flames, feeding it with wood, and occasionally panicking if the wind shifted or the coals looked too dim. It wasn't glamorous, but it was essential. You could go without breakfast. You could limp through a bad hunt. But if the fire went out? Now that was a group emergency. Starting a fire from scratch wasn't easy. It involved friction-based tools like fire drills or hand-spinning sticks over dry wood. If your hands were cold or your material damp, you could be there all day, hoping a tiny ember showed mercy. This is why many groups tried to keep a single fire going at all times, even when moving camp. In some cases, someone literally carried a glowing coal wrapped in moss or bark to keep the flame alive on the road. This person had one job, and the pressure was very real. Fuel collection was part of the deal too. Dry wood, kindling, animal dung, whatever burned without exploding was fair game. Children often helped, though they sometimes brought back things that looked flammable but absolutely weren't, like wet logs or half-buried mushrooms. Fire maintenance also had a social side. The fire was the centre of camp life. People sat around it, told stories, shared food, and argued about whose turn it was to keep watch. The fire pit was, in a way, the original living room, except if someone fell asleep on duty, it could freeze everyone to death. No one got praise for keeping the fire going. But if it went out, there were no excuses. Just a lot of angry looks and the sentence, "Guess who's making sparks tonight?" Contrary to popular belief, not every prehistoric person lived in a cave. Caves were great if you could find one. Natural shelter, wind protection, and built-in walls. But they weren't always available, especially if other groups or wild animals had already claimed them. So, like any determined human, early people built their own homes. Sort of. Construction in the Paleolithic era wasn't about aesthetics. There were no blueprints, no architects, and certainly no HOA regulations. The main goal was simple: keep the weather out and the people in. If you lived in an area without usable caves, you probably built huts or shelters from wood, bones, mud, grass, and whatever else was lying around. A solid framework of branches or mammoth ribs would be lashed together with animal sinew or vines, then covered with hides, bark, or packed dirt. The result? A lopsided structure that leaked slightly less than standing outside. Building was a group effort. One person held the sticks, another did the tying, and someone stood nearby pretending they knew what they were doing. If it collapsed halfway through, nobody was surprised. You just picked it up and tried again, this time with extra stick. Weather was always a problem. Rain turned dirt floors into mud pits. Wind could rip hide coverings away like nature was trying to redecorate. Snow crushed entire shelters if they weren't reinforced. That's why some groups built seasonal structures. Light summer huts that could be quickly abandoned, and heavier winter shelters for long, miserable stretches of frozen time. Insulation was a luxury. If you were lucky, animal hides covered the walls and floor. If not, you just layered up and complained. The fire stayed in the centre, ideally with a hole in the roof to let smoke out, though it usually let in just as much cold. Furniture? Not really. A rock to sit on, a flat place to nap, and maybe a pile of hides for sleeping. Luxury was a warm corner with no drafts and a roof that didn't drip. And yet, even with limited materials, prehistoric people managed to build homes that worked. They weren't pretty, but they kept you alive, dryish, and occasionally upright during a windstorm. Parenting in the Paleolithic era came with no manuals, no podcasts, and definitely no baby strollers. Once a child was born, you were immediately responsible for keeping a small, loud, very breakable human alive in a world full of cliffs, predators, and sharp rocks. And you had to do it without losing your spear or your sanity. Childbirth itself was a community event. Painful, messy, and risky. If you survived it, congratulations. Now came the next challenge. Keeping your child warm, fed, and from sticking their fingers into the fire out of curiosity. Which they did, frequently. There were no diapers. Babies were swaddled in hides or plant fibre, and messes were just part of the job. You learned quickly to always set them down on rocks. Easier cleanup. Mothers usually breastfed for years, since there was no baby formula, and chewing meat for a toddler was not considered efficient. Discipline was practical. If a kid wandered too close to a cliff, you didn't give them a time out. You grabbed them by the leg and barked something like, "No fall!" The stakes were high, and safety rules had to be taught fast. Touching fire, chasing wolves, or trying to eat unknown berries were considered teachable moments, ideally before anything exploded, burned, or caused hallucinations. But Paleolithic parenting wasn't all danger. Kids played constantly, with sticks, stones, feathers, bugs, anything that looked remotely interesting. Play was how they learned. A child who liked throwing rocks might one day be the tribe's best hunter. A kid who sat still and watched the elders might become a shaman or healer. No one said, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" You just became something, depending on your survival skills and general luck. Older children helped with chores, gathering kindling, fetching water, chasing birds from drying meat. By the time they were 10, they were considered semi-functional members of society, still annoying, but now useful. There was no formal education, but children learned through observation, repetition, and trial by mud. They didn't have toys, they had nature, and nature didn't come with safety labels. After a long day of hunting, gathering, scraping, dodging wild animals, and parenting without sedation, early humans finally got to enjoy a bit of what we might call downtime. Of course, Paleolithic social life wasn't exactly wine tastings and brunch, but it was something. The heart of social activity was the fire. Once the sun dipped low and visibility dropped to "hope you don't trip over a sleeping dog," the group would circle around the flames, not for a party, but because it was the only source of warmth and light that didn't bite. Still, it served as the tribe's gathering point. Everyone came here to eat, talk, and unwind. Evening conversations weren't small talk about the weather. They were storytelling sessions. People shared the day's events, exaggerated hunts, and told tales about spirits, ancestors, or that one time someone fell into the river chasing a fish. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was how knowledge was passed down. What to eat, what to avoid, where the good hunting spots were, all wrapped in stories complete with dramatic grunts and arm waving. Music and dancing also made appearances, though it wasn't exactly coordinated. Someone would bang two stones together rhythmically, someone else might hum or chant, and suddenly 3 children would start spinning in circles because no one told them not to. Instruments included hollow bones, stretched hide drums, and literally anything that made a vaguely satisfying sound. Bragging was also a big part of social life. If someone had a successful hunt, they would mention it, repeatedly. If they made a sharp tool, they'd casually show it off while pretending not to care. Social status wasn't about wealth, it was about skills. Who could hunt? Who could lead? Who could keep the fire going without burning their own eyebrows off? And flirting? Oh, it happened. There weren't many options, so romantic gestures were often subtle. Sharing food, sitting closer to someone, or not laughing when they misidentified a pile of dung as a rare root. Relationships formed slowly, and usually with the quiet understanding that "you didn't throw a rock at me today" was a good sign. Courtship was subtle, practical, and usually involved more grunting than poetry. Still, early humans managed to figure out how to form partnerships, somehow, despite the complete lack of scented candles or deodorant. The first step in courtship was proximity. You lived in a small band of maybe 20 to 40 people, which meant your dating pool was basically whoever hadn't already been claimed by someone else or wasn't related to you. Not ideal, but there was no prehistoric version of Tinder, unless you count locking eyes while chewing the same piece of roasted squirrel. Flirting was quiet, and by today's standards, kind of strange. Sharing food was a big deal. If someone gave you the choicest piece of meat or a handful of berries they didn't technically have to part with, that was interest. Helping someone scrape a hide or carry water. Also a green flag. Early romance was based on effort, not eloquence. Appearance mattered, but only up to a point. You weren't judged on your outfit. Everyone wore some variation of fur and dirt. What counted was your ability to survive. A good hunter or skilled forager had a better shot at attracting a mate than someone who sat by the fire all day carving questionable-looking statues. Pair bonds were often long-term, but not always permanent. People stayed together for cooperation, raising children, sharing food, surviving bad winters. If it wasn't working, a quiet separation occurred. No paperwork, just fewer shared tasks, and more awkward silences during group meals. Sexual relationships were probably more flexible than modern assumptions allow. Some anthropologists suggest that early humans were less possessive than later agricultural societies. Group dynamics, survival needs, and mobility often shaped relationship norms more than personal jealousy. And, of course, there were no love songs, just quiet companionship, a shared blanket, and the mutual understanding that neither of you wanted to get eaten alone. It may not have looked romantic, but it worked. Paleolithic couples built families, raised children, and made it through storms, all without once arguing about who forgot to do the dishes, mostly because there were no dishes. Despite the constant need to hunt, gather, and not die, early humans still found time for something uniquely human: art. And while they didn't have galleries, museums, or the phrase "that's very abstract," they did have walls. Big, cold cave walls. And apparently those were just begging for decoration. The earliest known cave paintings date back over 30,000 years, with famous examples found in places like Lascaux and Chauvet in modern-day France. These weren't random doodles. They featured animals like bison, deer, horses, and mammoths, often drawn with surprising accuracy and motion. Some had lines showing movement, others had dots, handprints, or symbols whose meaning we still haven't cracked. What tools did they use? Nothing fancy, just natural pigments like charcoal, ochre, and manganese, crushed minerals mixed with water, fat, or spit. For brushes, they used fingers, sticks, chewed-up ends of plants, or hollow bones to spray pigment across their stenciled hands. Yes, prehistoric people invented airbrushing long before it showed up on motorcycles. Why did they paint? No one knows for sure. Maybe it was storytelling. Maybe spiritual beliefs. Maybe someone just had an eye for composition, and no one told them to stop. Some anthropologists believe the art was connected to hunting rituals, a way to summon success, or pass on knowledge about which animals to chase and which ones to avoid. The artists probably worked by firelight, deep inside caves, in places no one lived, meaning they were making art just to make it. No commercial gain, no Instagram followers, just human expression in the rawest form. Kids likely got in on it too. Some caves include tiny handprints, suggesting that even little ones were taught how to make their mark, literally. And while we'll never know who made the first bison sketch, odds are someone stood behind them, grunting in approval or offering very unhelpful critiques. What's remarkable is that this art lasted. Long after the huts rotted and the fire pits crumbled, those painted animals still gallop across cave walls. Proof that even 30,000 years ago, humans needed more than just food and shelter. They needed to create. Also, maybe they just really liked bison. Getting sick or injured in the Paleolithic era was a bit like rolling dice with the universe. Only the dice were made of bone and had mostly bad sides. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and definitely no urgent care. If you broke something, cut yourself, or developed a mysterious rash, the best-case scenario was that your body handled it. The worst-case scenario, well, everyone gathered awkwardly around your fire and hoped it didn't look contagious. Medical care existed, but it was basic. Extremely basic. Early humans likely had some understanding of plants that reduced pain or inflammation. Chewed bark, roots, or crushed herbs might have served as primitive medicine. Willow bark, for instance, contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. So somewhere out there, a Paleolithic person was the first to discover pain relief by gnawing on a tree. For wounds, treatment often involved cleaning the area with water or antiseptic plants, if known, wrapping it in animal hide or moss and then watching it closely. Infection was the real killer, not the injury itself. There were no sterile bandages. If the wound got red, hot and started to smell, well, that was the smell of bad news. Broken bones? Sometimes they healed, sometimes they didn't. There's archaeological evidence of prehistoric skeletons with healed fractures, suggesting that care was given and rest was enforced. But there were also people who clearly kept moving on bad limbs, because there wasn't much choice. Toothaches were another issue. Teeth wore down from constant chewing of tough meat and grit-filled plants. Cavities weren't common, but tooth decay and jaw infections did happen. The solution? Removal, with a rock, and no anesthesia. Shamans or medicine people may have served as early doctors, part herbalist, part spiritual guide, part person who was willing to touch pus. They used rituals, chants, and substances we might now consider mildly hallucinogenic. Was it science? No. Did it work? Sometimes. The truth is, medical care back then was a combination of trial, error, and survival instincts. You got rest, you got attention, and sometimes you got lucky. And if you didn't, your spot by the fire went to someone else by nightfall. In the Paleolithic world, there were no wagons, no wheels, no roads, and absolutely no concept of catching a ride. If you wanted to go somewhere, you walked. That was it. Travel wasn't a convenience, it was a physical commitment. Whether you were moving camp, following game, or avoiding the neighbours who kept stealing your firewood, it always meant using your own 2 feet. Mobility was essential. Paleolithic groups were typically nomadic, moving as needed based on seasons, food availability, and possibly just to escape the smell of the old camp. Campsites didn't come with leases. Once the local resources were used up or the mammoths moved on, the people followed. Trips could be short, a day's walk to a nearby hunting ground, or much longer, spanning dozens of miles over several days or even weeks. Everything had to be carried. Tools, hides, fire-starting gear, food, if there was any left, and children all had to be packed up and hauled on your back. There were no suitcases, just bags made from leather or baskets made from woven reeds. And don't forget the weather. Travelling meant exposure. Rain, wind, snow. You endured it all, possibly while trying to convince a tired 5-year-old that yes, they really did have to keep walking. Again, uphill. Navigation wasn't done with maps. People used memory, landmarks, star patterns, animal tracks, and oral knowledge passed through generations. That mountain that looks like a sleeping bear, or the bend in the river that smells funny, were as close to street signs as you got. Group movement had to be organised. Scouts might go ahead to check for threats. Everyone else moved carefully, often in single file. If someone got injured, the entire group slowed down. If the weather turned, you found shelter. Fast. Speed was important, but so was staying together. Getting separated in prehistoric wilderness was rarely survivable. Despite all that, people covered serious ground. Fossils and artifacts show that Paleolithic humans migrated across continents, on foot, no GPS, no water bottles, no Spotify, just survival, sore feet, and the unshakable human drive to see what was beyond the next hill. After a long day of hunting, gathering, walking, parenting, tool fixing, and generally not dying, early humans ended their day in the only place that made sense: around the fire. The sun dropped quickly, and with no electric lights or lanterns, darkness arrived fast and without negotiation. That's when the group settled in for the night's final act, equal parts winding down and survival maintenance. Dinner, if you were lucky, involved roasted meat, boiled roots, or whatever edible thing didn't escape earlier. Meals were shared communally, everyone sitting in a loose circle, crouched or cross-legged, eating with hands, bones, or the occasional sharpened stick. There was no formal etiquette, but unspoken rules definitely applied. For example, don't snatch the last bite unless you were the one who speared it. After eating, people talked. Not just survival plans or food logistics. They shared stories, myths, memories, cautionary tales about that one guy who tried to hug a porcupine. Oral storytelling was the Paleolithic version of Netflix minus buffering. These stories passed down knowledge, entertained kids, and probably exaggerated everyone's hunting skills by at least 30%. Sometimes there was singing, rhythmic, simple chants or calls passed between voices. A piece of bone might double as a flute. A hollow log? Drum? The music wasn't polished, but it didn't have to be. It kept the cold away just a little longer. By now, most people were physically drained. The day didn't leave much energy for deep philosophical discussions. Kids passed out first, curled up next to parents or in a pile of furs. Adults lingered longer, staring into the fire like it held answers. Or maybe just zoning out. Same thing. Before sleep, someone always checked the fire, the unsung hero of the group. If the flames looked low, they were fed. If the wind shifted, barriers were adjusted. And if someone forgot to check, well, they'd hear about it first thing in the morning. In December 1938, two German scientists, Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, bombarded uranium with neutrons, and the results were baffling. They hadn't just altered the element, they had split it. Nuclear fission had just been discovered. Word of the experiment raced through the global physics community like a lightning strike. And while the implications were still theoretical, one thing was instantly clear. If fission could be controlled and harnessed, it could unleash an explosion of unimaginable power. And that terrified the scientific world, especially in the United States, because Nazi Germany, home to some of the brightest physicists on Earth, had just taken the first step toward a doomsday weapon. Physicist Leo Szilard, a Hungarian Jew who had fled Europe, immediately grasped the stakes. If Hitler's scientists built an atomic bomb first, the world wouldn't just lose a war, it might lose its future. Alongside fellow refugee Albert Einstein, Szilard drafted a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning that the Germans might be working on exactly that. Einstein signed it. The letter was delivered in October 1939. Less than 2 months after World War II had begun. Roosevelt didn't rush into action, but he didn't ignore it either. He formed an advisory committee on uranium. Funding trickled in, slowly. At first, the United States simply wasn't ready to take nuclear physics seriously as a weapon of war. That would soon change. By 1941, the British had confirmed the bomb's feasibility. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. The US had entered the war. And what started as a vague concern suddenly became a high-stakes, time-sensitive race. Enter General Leslie Groves, a no-nonsense military man who'd just built the Pentagon. He was appointed head of the newly minted Manhattan Engineer District in 1942. Its purpose? Simple on paper. Build an atomic bomb before the Nazis did. In practice? It was the most secretive, expensive, and scientifically complex project ever attempted. Groves brought in a young, flamboyant, theoretical physicist to lead the science. J. Robert Oppenheimer. Brilliant, controversial, idealistic. A man who could calculate particle probabilities and quote Sanskrit poetry in the same breath. Together, they launched what would become known as the Manhattan Project, a $2 billion gamble that would forever change the nature of warfare and the fate of the world. The Manhattan Project wasn't just a lab experiment, it was an empire. To pull off the impossible, the US government created an entire hidden civilization, stretching across the country, shrouded in secrecy. No one outside the project knew its real purpose. Most of the people inside didn't either. At the heart of this secret world were 3 main sites. First, Los Alamos, New Mexico, a dusty mesa chosen for its remoteness. This would be the brain of the project, where theoretical physics met practical engineering. Here, Oppenheimer assembled a dream team of scientists. Niels Bohr, Richard Feynman, Enrico Fermi, and dozens of others. Many were European émigrés fleeing fascism. Some had no idea what they were truly building. Second, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where entire factories, as long as several football fields, were built from scratch. Their mission? Enrich uranium, one of the two elements needed for an atomic bomb. Problem was, uranium-235 was incredibly rare, less than 1% of natural uranium. So engineers tried everything: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, even calutrons. Thousands of workers, most of them women, operated machinery they didn't understand, never knowing they were helping enrich bomb fuel. Third, Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was bred. This was the second path to the bomb. Plutonium didn't occur naturally in usable amounts, but in huge nuclear reactors, built in the middle of nowhere, uranium could be bombarded to produce it. Then it had to be extracted, refined, and shipped to Los Alamos for weaponization. The reactors ran around the clock, creating a new element, and new nightmares. Radiation leaks, contamination, and the birth of the nuclear age's environmental costs all began here. Over 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, more than the population of some US states at the time. They built secret towns, complete with housing, schools, stores, and security fences. Mail was censored. Phone calls were monitored. Workers were told only what they needed to know. Even Vice President Harry Truman had no idea what the project was until he became president. This wasn't just a science project. It was industrial, military, bureaucratic, and deeply human. People fell in love, gave birth, suffered accidents, got bored, and died, all in service of an invention they couldn't name. The project had become a hidden America, and it was inching closer, day by day, to building the deadliest weapon in history. J. Robert Oppenheimer wasn't your typical military contractor. He wasn't even a typical scientist. Brilliant, erratic, aristocratic, and deeply philosophical, Oppenheimer spoke 6 languages, quoted the Bhagavad Gita, and smoked constantly. He had a sharp tongue, fragile health, and an uncanny ability to solve theoretical puzzles that stumped everyone else. To many, he seemed more poet than physicist, but under pressure, he was the glue that held Los Alamos together. Appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project by General Groves, Oppenheimer quickly proved he was more than just an academic. He had an intuitive understanding of people and politics. He could inspire loyalty and manage egos. No small feat considering he was working with some of the most brilliant minds on Earth, each with a Nobel Prize-level intellect and a reputation to match. But he also had a dark side. Oppenheimer's earlier associations with Communist Party members, including his brother and his mistress, Jean Tatlock, raised red flags for military intelligence. Groves overruled objections and pushed ahead with Oppenheimer anyway, but the file on him was thick and getting thicker. Still, Oppenheimer's ability to visualize how theoretical physics could become physical machinery made him indispensable. At Los Alamos, he led with a mix of charisma and obsession, often sleeping just a few hours a night. He'd race between chalkboards and meetings, scribbling formulas, arguing designs, and chain-smoking until dawn. He was at the center of everything: atomic configurations, bomb casing designs, neutron reflectors, even the seating charts at briefings. He was also painfully aware of the consequences. Oppenheimer believed beating the Nazis to the bomb was morally necessary. But as the war in Europe neared its end, and Germany's nuclear program collapsed, he grew uneasy. The bomb was no longer just a defensive weapon. It was becoming a political weapon. This paradox haunted him. He had summoned the greatest minds of the age to unleash destruction never before imagined. Every success brought them closer not to victory, but to a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. In private, Oppenheimer remained conflicted. In public, he remained focused. As the team finalized bomb designs, one chilling truth grew clearer. They wouldn't just be changing warfare, they'd be changing the nature of humanity's relationship with power itself. By late 1944, theory had given way to blueprints. Blueprints became parts. Parts became prototypes. The Manhattan Project was no longer an experiment. It was an assembly line for Armageddon. But building a nuclear bomb wasn't like building a tank or a plane. This was uncharted territory, and nothing came easy. Engineers, machinists, and physicists at Los Alamos were now focused on two types of bombs, each with its own terrifying complexity. The first was the uranium bomb, nicknamed Little Boy. It relied on the principle of a gun-type mechanism. Fire one chunk of uranium-235 into another at high speed, and you get a chain reaction. Simple in concept, horrifying in practice. The enriched uranium came from Oak Ridge, Tennessee, in tiny, hard-earned quantities. Each gram took enormous effort, and they needed over 60 kilograms. Every calculation had to be perfect. There would be no test run. Little Boy would go straight to the battlefield. The second bomb, Fat Man, used plutonium. But plutonium was trickier. A gun-type design wouldn't work. Plutonium would pre-detonate, fizzling out before it reached full power. Instead, they had to develop a completely different method: implosion. This meant precisely timed explosive lenses would compress a plutonium core into a critical mass in microseconds. It was like trying to crush a steel ball evenly from all sides using dynamite, without cracking the shell. To make matters worse, plutonium was toxic, unstable, and newly invented. The scientists worked under extreme secrecy and stress. Accidents happened. In 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian accidentally dropped a tungsten brick into a plutonium core, initiating a critical reaction. He absorbed a lethal dose of radiation and died weeks later. The Demon Core, as it was called, would kill another scientist, Louis Slotin, months later, in an eerily similar accident. Every step forward carried a cost, physically, mentally, morally. Meanwhile, time was running out. Germany had surrendered, Japan fought on, and Washington wanted results. The scientists at Los Alamos knew what they were making, but not where it would go or who it would kill. Inside the workshops, the final pieces were coming together. Metal casings, precision detonators, nuclear cores. Each component, a marvel of science. Together, they would form humanity's most lethal invention. The only thing left now was to test it. Not in theory, not in simulation. In fire, in desert, in real life. On July 16, 1945, at precisely 5:29 a.m., the New Mexico desert turned into the birthplace of the nuclear age. The test was codenamed Trinity, and it was the first detonation of a nuclear device in human history. The bomb they tested was a plutonium implosion design, the same type as Fat Man. It had never been tested before. Unlike Little Boy, which the scientists believed would work based on simple physics, Fat Man's complex implosion mechanism made it unpredictable. It could fail, it could fizzle, or it could destroy everything around them. Tension ran high. Oppenheimer, Groves, and hundreds of scientists gathered at observation points miles from the detonation site. Many wore welding goggles. Some had sunscreen smeared on their faces, hoping it would protect them from the unknown light that was about to be born. Others took bets on whether the blast would ignite the atmosphere. It sounds absurd now, but back then, they genuinely weren't sure. At the exact moment of detonation, the desert exploded with a flash brighter than the sun. The shockwave knocked people off their feet. The heat could be felt over 10 miles away. A mushroom cloud soared 40,000 feet into the sky. The earth itself seemed to pause. One observer described it as being present at the birth of the world. Another said it felt like the gates of hell had opened. Oppenheimer didn't cheer. He whispered a line from the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The test was a success, a terrifying, undeniable success. It confirmed that the United States now possessed a weapon that could annihilate entire cities in seconds. But it also marked the beginning of a profound moral reckoning. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded. Glass-like sand, now called trinitite, formed at ground zero. But what lingered most wasn't scientific data, it was silence, awe, and the haunting awareness that mankind had crossed a threshold that could never be uncrossed. News of the test was kept tightly sealed. President Truman, then attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, was informed via a coded message. The baby is born. The war was still raging in the Pacific. Japan had not yet surrendered. And now, the United States held the power of annihilation. The question wasn't if they would use it. It was where and when. Less than a month after the Trinity test, the theoretical horror became a real one. The United States had 2 working bombs and a fateful decision to make. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island. Its payload, Little Boy, the uranium bomb. The target, Hiroshima, a city of military importance, but also full of civilians. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb was released. 43 seconds later, the sky erupted. The explosion leveled 5 square miles of the city. Temperatures reached 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit at the epicenter. Over 70,000 people died instantly, vaporized or crushed. Fires raged. Survivors, burned and blinded, stumbled through a nightmare landscape of twisted steel and ash. In the following weeks, tens of thousands more would die from radiation sickness, injuries, and trauma. The world had never seen destruction like this. And yet, the war continued. Japan's leaders hesitated. Some wanted surrender, others wanted terms. The US, interpreting silence as resistance, prepared a second strike. On August 9th, the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, was loaded onto another B-29, Boxcar. The primary target was Kokura, but cloud cover forced a change. The bomb was dropped over Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. The terrain of Nagasaki limited the blast somewhat, but the destruction was still catastrophic. Around 40,000 people died instantly. The blast obliterated factories, homes, temples. Once again, thousands more would succumb in the following days from burns, trauma, and radiation. Within hours, the Japanese cabinet convened in chaos. The emperor himself, Hirohito, intervened. For the first time in history, a Japanese emperor spoke directly to his people, announcing unconditional surrender. The war was over. But the debate had just begun. Did the bombs end the war, or did they usher in something worse? Were they necessary, or a horrific show of force? Some scientists had begged for a demonstration instead of a city strike. Their pleas were ignored. Others, like General Groves, felt no remorse at all. The world had entered a new reality, one where peace was enforced by the threat of absolute destruction. The bomb had done its job, militarily, but morally, philosophically, spiritually? Those questions would echo for generations. What was undeniable? In 2 flashes of light, the 20th century had split. There was the world before the bomb, and everything that came after. The mushroom clouds had barely settled before the world, and especially those involved, began to wrestle with what had just happened. At Los Alamos, the celebrations were muted. Yes, the bomb had worked. Yes, the war was over. But the scale of devastation stunned even those who had built it. Photos of charred bodies and flattened cities reached the laboratories. Survivors' stories trickled in. Scientists who once poured their genius into making the weapon now stared into an ethical abyss. Many felt they'd unleashed something far bigger than they understood. Oppenheimer, in particular, was shattered. Though once the charismatic heart of the Manhattan Project, he was now a man haunted. In a meeting with President Truman shortly after the war, he reportedly said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, according to his staff, was disgusted. He later called Oppenheimer a crybaby scientist. But the ethical crisis wasn't confined to one man. Scientists like Leo Szilard and James Frank circulated petitions urging transparency and international control of nuclear weapons. They warned that secrecy and unchecked arsenals would lead to an arms race. Their reports were ignored. Instead, the US tightened control over nuclear research. The Atomic Energy Commission was formed. The Cold War began to simmer, and the Soviets, already aware of the Manhattan Project thanks to extensive espionage, were racing to build a bomb of their own. Meanwhile, many Manhattan Project workers, especially those at Oak Ridge and Hanford, began to learn, often for the first time, what they had been a part of. Some were proud, others were horrified. The public too was split. American newspapers cheered the end of the war. But slowly, images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki began to appear. Questions followed. Could Japan have been forced to surrender another way? Were both bombs necessary? Was this justice or vengeance? And then came the reality of radiation. Survivors of the bombings, hibakusha as they came to be known, suffered burns, cancers, miscarriages, and lifelong stigma. Fallout studies began.